Ethan. You were right. I did lie to you. I shouldn't have. All I can say is that if you get this, stay away.
As you might expect from a series 7 entries deep, there's a lot to compare Resident Evil 7 against. Throughout the game, there's a constant push and pull between the new and the old, not just in terms of the series, but in terms of the genre. Out of that back and forth, something new emerges. Resident Evil has been reborn. Via a first-person perspective, players inhabit the role of Ethan Winters as he searches for his wife Mia, who's been missing and presumed dead for 3 years. A video message from her leads him to an overgrown plantation in Louisiana. It's not as abandoned as it seems, as it's home to the creepy Baker family who pursue you and hang over the events of the whole game. Needless to say, things quickly spiral out of control, and to say too much would spoil the twists and turns Resident Evil 7 so expertly takes you through. Both the setting and the plot are more expansive than they might initially seem, often in terms of little details rather than a huge scope. The first-person perspective works wonders at immersing you within the game. Resident Evil 7 is a visceral experience more often than it isn't, and whether it's experiencing body horror firsthand, or simply struggling to see every corner of a creaky room at once, it really hammers home the situation viewing it from that perspective. It doesn't just feel like a cheap trick.
Oh god,
Oh no!
Oh god!
Run!
Despite the perspective change, it still feels as Resident Evil as ever, keeping with the series' roots once it begins to open up after the pulse-pounding, though linear introduction sequence. Creeping through narrow corridors, juggling inventory space, and trying to make your way through strange puzzles and locked doors. The feelings throw you right back to the old school survival horror of the original Resident Evil, though touched up in a delightfully modern way. The Bakers are fantastic antagonists, or should that be supervillains. They have their own unique and bombastic personality, and their own set of what are basically superpowers. Each one leaves a strong impression that'll stay with you after the credits roll. Even the Baker household itself becomes an iconic structure on par with that of the Spencer Mansion, though with its own vibes entirely. Jack Baker, voiced by Jack Brand, the daddy of the family who will be the bane of your existence early on in the game, perhaps leaves the strongest impression. He stalks the corridors of the house and will relentlessly pursue you once you have his attention. His excitable, hair-raising Southern American drawl and the way he taunts and toys with you as he gives chase will likely forever be iconic for the series. Welcome to the family, son.
I'm gonna squash you like a bug. Hope margarita. God damn! How am I gonna replace this?
Those worried Resident Evil 7 cribs too much from the likes of Outlast or Amnesia: The Dark Descent can rest easy. While there are elements of Pursuit that are done very well, these only form small pockets of the Resident Evil 7 experience. The bulk of the time is spent exploring and dealing with enemies. Resident Evil 7 stock enemies this time are the Molded, gross, blobby creatures that come in a few different flavors, normal, quick, bulkier, etc, etc. A lot of the time engaging in combat isn't strictly necessary though. You can dash around, hiding in rooms and closing doors to get the advantage on most enemies and to conserve ammo. Ammunition is indeed relatively sparse for most of the game. Enemies lurch around unpredictably, making it hard to aim, and have some pretty long-reaching attacks and occasional bursts of speed. It's all about creating distance and being careful with ammo if you want to take them out. In its gunplay as well as the rest of the game, Resident Evil 7 favours a considered and slower approach. The Molded are unpredictable enough to be a challenge, but they do get a bit tiresome as it progresses. Variety that is added to their ranks isn't really surprising, and after the second area adds a completely new enemy type, it's a shame nothing too shocking ever happens with the Molded as stock enemies when they come back. The house is filled with collectibles, things like health, ammo, and crafting pickups. Without the use of a special drug item that highlights pickups, it's pretty hard to find everything. They'll be hidden in drawers, corners, under furniture and the like. It's yet another facet of the game that rewards a slower pace. Crafting always requires the use of chem fluid, whether it be for support items like health or for ammunition. There's a constant balance of resources and risk, but it's simplified to the point of not being overwhelming. For instance, you can craft using a simple crafting menu if you don't want to do it all by hand. Complex game design is at play throughout the entirety of Resident Evil 7, but the way it's often presented to the player is simple and easy to understand. Resident Evil 7 is survival horror refined, modernized, thoughtfully plated. There are also a handful of optional sections that take the form of videotapes. You can put these into any video player to replay that section if you want to go back to it.
I can't let her catch me again.
For the most part though, you don't need to do them ever, though you'll definitely want to. They can provide hints about Ethan's journey and slices of backstory. One particular highlight moment of the game is a tape in which you play as a prior victim, caught in a Saw-style death trap room. Later you can then use knowledge of that trap to your own, Ethan's, advantage. It would have been nice to see more made from this, more tapes and more ones that directly give Ethan prior knowledge advantage. All in all there's only about 5, though Mora promises DLC. The way the tapes already in the game interact with the main narrative is one of the most interesting things about it though, and more DLC tapes, what a great way of adding to the game itself, might not supplement the game in the same narrative way. The length of the game feels pretty solid, not too long, not too short. On top of that, the game rewards replay with a New Game Plus, incentivizes speedrunning, and has a Madhouse mode that makes the game harder and reshuffles enemies and items, making for an experience that feels quite different to the main game. And the game itself is fabulously paced too. While it would be nice to see more made from some of its standout features, areas and antagonists never stick around too long, it stays away from letting anything get too stale. By the time you reach about 2/3 of the way through the game, everything's quite different to the beginning of the game, but the journey and the curve to that point feels so natural that it's not really a problem. There is more shooty gun towards the end, but even at that point you can quite safely run past many key threats if you choose to do so, which I did. Resident Evil 7 is also entirely playable in PlayStation VR. Of course, this enhances the first-person perspective to a degree, and presents some truly great moments. Even just looking around the trailer as it appears in the title screen is pretty entertaining. However, there's a lot of caveats that make the experience a little bit weird in VR. There's a lot of fades to black and back as it avoids certain situations that would be too much in VR. The analog control flicks instantly 20 degrees or so, rather than turning fluidly. Crouching sees you instantly toggle your height, and you can move your head back and forth even while being grabbed by something, so often interactions with your character feel removed and distant after you've flinched back a little bit. That would just be like grabbing at thin air when they're meant to be grabbing your collar. Don't get me wrong, it is neat and it's the biggest and baddest VR game on the market in terms of being given the full AAA treatment, but it still feels a little bit like a gimmick. A very, very cool gimmick, mind you. Thankfully, that does mean that the game doesn't feel like it's been built around a VR experience. The decisions that make Resident Evil 7 so great are just decisions that make a great game, not going out of their way to make it, ooh, pop for VR. No, the decisions here have been to make a great game. Just because it's first person doesn't mean they've gone out of their way to make VR the best and de facto way. In fact, I would recommend not playing in VR, probably. I found it a bit immersion breaking, some of the caveats. There's a huge amount to admire in Resident Evil 7. It's at once very old school and at the same time very informed by modern game design and improvements to the genre. It's definitely a new direction to the series, but not one that feels purely reactionary. It's a considered rethink of the series that lays out all of the core vibes that made the original game so strong, and doubles down on them. Out of that blend of old and new, Resident Evil 7 feels like a breath of fresh air, completely its own thing. Rather than being something that's just inspired by what came before, Resident Evil 7 will likely be inspiring the horror genre directly for a long time to come.
Special feast. My boy.
Welcome to the family, son.